What is the value of that practice?
For the longest time, central banks have been expected to achieve what's known as price stability. Now, that's a worthy goal, but the question became, how do you define it? How do you judge whether you're there or not? And so many central banks have wanted to set an exact benchmark on where they want to see inflation, both to be transparent, but also to try and anchor inflation expectations, which can play a very big role in asset pricing.
And often it's 2%. What's the magic of that percentage?
I did some work into that, and believe it or not, I think I can trace its origins to, of all places, New Zealand, which was the first developed country to adopt an inflation target. They adopted a 1 to 3% range, and no magic to it. I don't think there was any research behind it, but soon thereafter, every other central bank that was adopting an inflation target picked two: the Bank of England, the Bank of Canada, the European Central Bank, and then ultimately in 2012, the Federal Reserve.
And we're seeing globally, banks are struggling to meet that target. Why?
Just about every developed market is seeing their inflation well below the 2% target, and it's been a bit of a struggle. I think the main reason is, Doug, that prices in general are determined by global supply and demand, where individual central banks can only really influence conditions in a portion of the global picture. So the ability of an individual central bank to reach a target, I think, is much more limited, and has become more limited as the economy has gotten more global.
So is this an attainable target? Should it be changed? What's your view?
I would say this. I do not think that central banks should press so hard to get to a 2% target that they end up doing things that are unnatural for their economy. And for instance, if we wanted to get to 2%, we would do a lot more quantitative easing of purchases by the central bank. That could create all kinds of distortions in asset markets that we just don't want. Maybe it's better to live with inflation that's a little bit below the target than press too hard to get there.
It's the biggest change to the IMF's special drawing rights, or SDR basket, since the inclusion of the euro in 1999. China's yuan, or renminbi, is now part of a very exclusive club.
The renminbi's inclusion is clearly an important milestone in a journey that has begun months, if not years ago. A journey which is a transition towards more market-driven principle of the macroeconomic framework of China.
To join the SDR, a nation must be a large exporter, a status that China achieved a long time ago.
They have more trade than any other country in the world. They now have a benchmark oil contract that they're trading in yuan. They're doing a lot of trading in the East in yuan, and the East is only going to get larger, and their power within the East, I think, is only going to get greater.
A second IMF criteria is having a currency that is freely usable. Over the past several years, China has executed many reforms to make this happen, like putting more yuan in global circulation.
China has swap lines where other countries can access China's currency, China can access their other country's currency with about 25 different countries. It's gone from practically nothing in terms of world trade to being maybe the fourth or fifth most important currency.
A reality the IMF is now recognizing in an official way.
I think the number one thing for China is just prestige. You know, it's very prestigious, you know, on the global stage to be considered one of the reserve currencies. It shows that China is moving towards a more flexible currency and is accepted by the world economy as a major leader.
Effective October next year, the yuan will officially be a part of IMF's SDR basket. Each currency in the basket is given a weighting. The yuan will have a weighting of 10.9%, slightly higher than the Japanese yen and pound sterling. Getting the IMF stamp of approval will not only help China internationalize its currency, but many economists predict that over time we'll see more governments around the world hold large quantities of renminbi as part of their foreign exchange reserves. Tracy Tandon, CCTV, New York.
Risks to global financial stability have indeed increased over the last 6 months, and this has been due to three main factors. First, higher macroeconomic risks in the context of a weaker growth and inflation outlook. Second, falling commodity prices and increasing concerns about China which have put pressure on emerging markets and in credit markets in advanced economies. And third, lower confidence in policies and in policy traction in an environment of higher economic, financial, and political and geopolitical risks. Now, all of this has been reflected into the market turmoil, which to me is not just a one-off event, but a signal that there is still more work to be done. It is essential that banks' remaining challenges are addressed once and for all because they're key to financing the economic recovery. Banks are pressured
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our session, and уважаемые дамы и господа, мы начинаем нашу сессию. Mr. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Well, let me start off by welcoming all of you to this session where we want to cover monetary and financial challenges that are facing countries in the region. And I want to take you back to the conversation that we were having early this morning in this room when people were talking about some of the consequences of how the countries are reacting to the various shocks that have hit them recently, shocks in terms of lower oil prices, shocks in terms of slowdown in their neighboring countries, the big trading partners, and shocks also in terms of the way in which major currencies that have an impact on these countries have moved themselves. And in particular, I'm thinking, of course, of the depreciation in the value of the ruble as well as the appreciation in the US dollar. Now, I think in the face of all of these shocks, these countries in the region have had macroeconomic frameworks that have been a bit challenged from time to time in coping with these shocks. Most of the countries in the region, almost all of them, have changed their own exchange rate values, and many of them have also moved to adopting more flexible systems of managing their exchange rate. Some of them have gone explicitly to targeting inflation. Others are moving in that direction, although they're not quite at the point where you would say they're targeting inflation as their primary policy tool. So I think what we want to talk about today in this panel is really how are the implications of moving to different monetary and financial management frameworks being handled, what challenges do they pose, what challenges in terms of institutional capacity building will need to be addressed to successfully able to navigate a system based on inflation targeting. And what lessons can we draw from the experience of other countries that have been going through this same framework? How does the global current configuration of monetary policy in the main economic zones, the United States, the Euro area, what's happening in Japan, what's happening in China, how does that impact the challenge facing countries in this region in terms of macroeconomic and financial management? So we have 4 extremely qualified panelists who are able to look at these issues from different perspectives, and I'm particularly happy that actually, if you look at the composition of our panelists, they bring a different perspective, each one, to this, so that we'll be able to have a conversation that is based on drawing together the different views and dimensions of this issue. And I'm going to start, if I may, with Athanasios Orphanides, who is a professor of the practice of global economics and management at MIT. Some of us also knew him from his earlier incarnation when he was a policymaker as governor of the Bank of Cyprus. Then I'm going to ask Juha Kahkonen, who is a deputy director in the IMF's Middle East and Central Asia department, and who has been leading a team of work that, a team of colleagues that have been working on a paper precisely on this issue of exchange rate and monetary policy frameworks for the region, which paper should be available outside, in fact, to those who are interested. I'll ask Juha to set out a little bit how the IMF view on this set of issues is evolving. Then from there, I'd like to go a little bit to Bembya Khulkhachiev, sitting on my right, and get a perspective from the Eurasian Economic Commission, where he is director of financial policy, because that gives us also a sense of how what is being done at the individual country level fits into the broader sense of a regional and eventually a monetary union, economic union as well, and also in terms of how some of the evolution in terms of the yuan, in terms of the renminbi, it could have an impact on the region. And finally, I'd like to come to Tom Sargent, who's a Nobel laureate in economics, and who I would like perhaps to then at the end pick up a bit, having listened to these different perspectives, on how this fits into the general framework and our understanding of what is required to be able to effectively implement and put in place a monetary policy framework that is based on targeting of inflation and away from using the nominal exchange rate as an anchor. So that's a little bit the plan for today. So if you agree, let me start first with Athanasios. And I know, Athanasios, you have a small presentation also that you would like to make, which is great. And I know that you're also going to talk a little bit by looking at the difference in monetary policy currently between the Fed and the euro area, and how that makes the job of moving to inflation targeting more complicated for any country, including here. So let me first turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Masood. So indeed, I'm going to talk about the challenges of maintaining monetary stability. As we've talked in the previous session, this is a challenging environment for the area, challenging environment for the central bank in Kazakhstan, and I will use an example from the divergence of Fed and ECB policy as a particular challenge that would present problems for maintaining monetary stability for an economy that is affected by global developments to such an extent. So I'm going to start by highlighting, let's see if this works, the centerpiece, in my view, of how inflation targeting is done, a practice that is recent in Kazakhstan, but very important. So I'm reproducing here figure 61 from the latest available inflation report, that's in English at least, which is from the fourth quarter of last year. You can see here the challenges associated with two developments in the last couple of years. Number one, the developments in oil prices. Number two, the devaluation of the currency. This, of course, would have created some inflation. There is nothing unexpected there. And the question is, how can monetary authorities in a country ensure that the credibility of maintaining monetary stability going forward will be ensured when you have such developments? Inflation targeting is a framework that can help tremendously monetary authorities to achieve that by effectively communicating the determination, the commitment of the central bank to maintain policies that will bring inflation back to what is desirable for the country. You can see that in the figure in the darkest region, showing the central tendency of the forecast of the central bank, and also highlight the uncertainty around the prospects and given the sensitivity of the economy to foreign developments. What is this uncertainty coming from? Well, I don't need to be showing pictures like this to this audience, except to say that coming from the US, I show the West Texas intermediate version of the oil price, maybe slightly different from the benchmark price that you are using here. We've discussed earlier in the day what the implications may be of considerably lower prices going forward. But the other thing I would want to highlight here is to see the volatility that we have had in the last couple of decades, which impacts the economy overall. So in this environment, it's really incredibly difficult to maintain monetary stability with a fixed exchange rate regime. The state-of-the-art advice would suggest the adoption of a framework similar to inflation targeting, which is happening right now here. And this is important, as I mentioned before, to be able to see through many of the complexities that influence the global environment that then translates to the challenges in the specific country. Let me show you one of these challenges that I will spend a few minutes on going forward. Fed versus ECB. So we, of course, we're aware, if you look at the very, very end of the chart, the Fed started the process of normalization late last year, just one move up, one tick in the federal funds rate. At the same time, we know that the ECB decided to add accommodation. This is really a very unusual divergence in monetary policy we have. It's going to have global implications going forward, questions such as for how long we may have a divergence like this, what it may mean for the configuration of interest rates, and the relative exchange rate, which is going to have impact in the rest of the world. Because if we're talking about the US and the euro area, these are number 1, 2 largest economies in the world, unless you do the PPP weighting, in which case everything is overwhelmed by China. I'm not going to get into that. So we have a divergence in policy. We do not know currently how this will play out, but I want to point out that this is not a new thing. This is a divergence that actually started much earlier, that has been complicating global monetary affairs for a number of years. As Jacob Frankel was pointing out late this morning, we have had most major central banks, many major central banks operating at near zero interest rates. You see this here as well. Under those circumstances, central banks need to embark on unconventional measures. That means playing with the balance sheet of the central bank. Here you have a comparison of the size of the balance sheet of the ECB and the Federal Reserve. You can see for the Federal Reserve a consistent increase in the balance sheet, bringing it from about $1 trillion to $4.5 trillion. This is really what took the US economy out of the recession. You can see in the case of the euro area, you have a much more erratic situation. The size of the balance sheet in the summer of 2012 was at its maximum at about 3 trillion euros. Then you have a period of monetary policy tightening with a significant shrinking of the balance sheet. And now, since the ECB started doing QE last year, you have a period of accommodation. So I want to highlight here, you would not have been able to see the divergence in monetary policy just from interest rates in this setting. You need to be monitoring the balance sheet of the central bank. You would not have been able to see that one could predict differences in economic outcomes from this. Differences in policy, the fact that the ECB, for whatever reason, decided to have much tighter monetary policy for about 4 years, effectively, relative to the Federal Reserve, have implications for the economy. You can compare headline inflation. This is influenced by oil prices too much, so not very informative. You can compare core inflation measures, and here you can see that by being much more accommodative, the Federal Reserve actually managed to keep inflation closer to its objective. This is PCE inflation, the latest data, just a few tenths under 2%. If you looked at CPI inflation, it's already over 2%. In the case of the ECB, you see that by being overly tight, core inflation has been systematically below 1%, which is inconsistent with the mandate. So you can see a divergence in policy for a few years, which is what leads us to the current environment, and you can read that in the inflation results as well. Of course, differences in monetary policy over the cycle have real consequences. You can see this in a picture that Jacob Frankel also highlighted this morning. If I go there, the rates of unemployment in the euro area and the United States. You can see that the US economy is pretty much back to normal. The euro area economy has an unemployment rate. The latest numbers are still over 10 percentage points and much higher than even at the peak of the 2009-2010 recession. What you are missing by this, which is another of the elements that complicate the evaluation of the global monetary policy environment, is that, you know, for the US, it's actually pretty straightforward to evaluate things. In the euro area, because of the political problems that have appeared since the beginning of the euro area crisis, you really need to go into the details of what's driving the euro area. If you look at the unemployment here for the euro area, for example, let me highlight that it's not the same everywhere. Again, as Jacob Frankel had put it in different figures this morning. I have a decomposition here so you can see just how dramatic these differences are, which create incredible challenges for monetary stability in the euro area. The blue line here shows the unemployment rate for the euro area overall. The black line shows the unemployment rate for just one member state that happens to be almost 1/3 of the euro area. And the red line shows the unemployment rate in the rest. And you can see that if you exclude the largest member state from the euro area, the employment rate is actually over 12% in the euro area, which shows you just how dramatic the situation is. And of course, this is what is behind the fact that the ECB they absolutely have to inject additional monetary policy accommodation. This is what has been recognized, and this is what they have been doing since about a year and a half ago. But it wasn't enough. So the QE that the ECB started early last year was not enough. In March of this year, they took unprecedented decisions to cut interest rates into negative territory, again, complicated even further. The exchange rate situation, the transmission of monetary policy to the rest of the world, provide forward guidance on asset purchases, forward guidance on policy rates, liquidity expansion. If you can imagine this, you know, look, before the crisis, this was completely unimaginable in the central banking world. The ECB effectively promised that it will be giving free money to banks for 4 years, and it will be subsidizing the liquidity it's providing to banks for 4 years if those banks make loans. This was completely unimaginable before the crisis, but right now it's some of the things that have to be done. This has created quite a bit of resistance. The response from Berlin was very unkind to the ECB. The ECB was accused by senior officials of the German government that it's expropriating the little people. It's been accused of shading electoral results in Germany. The reason I highlight this is to show you what kind of complexity can get into the monetary policy of one of the largest member states, of the largest economies in the world, which is what is driving then divergences you see in policy, which is then creating all of these complexities for the rest of the world. There is no way to actually manage to maintain monetary stability in economies influenced by monetary developments in the US and the euro area, take all of these things into account with a fixed exchange rate regime or guided by an exchange rate regime. This is why it's so critical to actually adopt a framework like inflation targeting, that it can flexibly adjust to these developments in maintaining monetary policy stability in the country. I will end by just making one remark about further improving and strengthening the targeting. The inflation targeting framework can really be summarized in explaining how the central bank will maintain monetary stability in one chart, and this is the chart. In the latest inflation report, this was figure 61. I think the framework will become stronger as the framework is solidified and the communication around how the inflation forecasts are being created and what the central bank is willing to do to maintain the confidence of the public, and eventually making that figure 1 in the inflation report instead of figure 61.
Thank you very much, Athanasios. That gives us a good contextual basis for it. And maybe next year when we come back for a discussion at the next Asana Forum, we'll see what the number on that figure is, both whether it's moved from 61 to 1, but also whether the actions that the central bank will take in terms of shaping expectations will mean that the fan chart itself will begin to be a little bit narrower, so that the confidence levels associated would improve. Let me now turn to Juha, because you and the team have been looking at the impact of exchange rate movements in the region and how different countries are coping with it and what now remains to be done. So perhaps you could share with us your main conclusions and takeaways from that work, and then we can get other perspectives on it.
Thanks, Masood, and let me start with some shameless advertising. I mean, what I have in my hand and what should be on the screen soon is a copy of the paper that the IMF just launched, Exchange Rate Developments and Policies in the Caucasus and Central Asia. I'll summarize the main conclusions of the paper, hopefully in an interesting enough way for you to have the appetite to read the whole paper. It's available on the IMF website, and there are some copies outside also. The paper covers basically what has happened to exchange rates and exchange rate policies in the region over the past 2 years, what's the way forward, and what obstacles can be expected and how to overcome them. So what has happened? 2 years ago, almost all currencies in the region were tightly managed, closely linked to the US dollar. This was fine mostly at the time with oil prices high and growth in the region very robust. But many currencies in the region were somewhat overvalued at that time. All this changed since late 2014 when various external shocks hit the region. Oil and commodity prices declined sharply. The Russian economy slowed and moved into a recession. The Chinese economy slowed. The Russian ruble and other currencies were depreciating sharply. The US dollar strengthened. And all these developments put enormous pressure on the exchange rates in the region. The oil exporters among the 8 CCA countries mostly reacted by some intervention initially and then step devaluations. But some of them, like Kazakhstan, have moved to more or less a float by now. Among the oil importers, which have had smaller buffers, they allowed gradual moves in the exchange rate early on and have had significant gradual depreciation while intervening occasionally. And so 2 years later, we are in a situation where one way or another, all currencies in the region have weakened significantly and are closer to the fundamentals now, because while there's still some overvaluation in some currencies, the extent of it is smaller. So what's the way forward? We think that greater exchange rate flexibility is good for most, if not all, currencies in the region for various reasons. This will help alleviate misalignments, reduce one-way bets, protect the buffers that have come down quite significantly, and act as a shock absorber. And greater flexibility overall should help maintain competitiveness and support various reforms that the countries need in other areas. And indeed, countries in the region are implementing these moves towards greater flexibility. Many countries have started on the path to inflation targeting, while some others have more managed arrangements, but still some degree of flexibility. I'd like to emphasize that we are not dogmatic about flexibility. There's clearly a continuum from the pegs to full floats, and where each country is and should be along this continuum depends on various factors like the depth of the financial and foreign exchange markets, the size of the buffers of the countries, the capacity of the central banks to operate inflation targeting, the macro and structural policy mixes, and other country-specific circumstances. Now, what can be done to manage the transition to greater exchange rate flexibility? We would emphasize three things. The first is to modernize monetary policy. Second, address financial stability risks. And third, to strengthen communications. And let me start with modernizing monetary policy, which means both strengthening overall monetary frameworks and also monetary operations. It's important for central banks to declare clear medium-term inflation objectives, whether these are point or target range objectives. Communication that central banks have these targets and educating the population is important. It's also important to explain why inflation deviates from the target so that the central bank's credibility is maintained and enhanced. Most central banks in the region also need to significantly increase their technical and analytical capabilities in this area. And while practically all central banks have de jure independence, de facto independence is much weaker, and there's room to strengthen that. In terms of monetary operations, given the loss of the exchange rate as the nominal anchor, there's a need to institute an alternative anchor, typically a policy rate, and effective open market operations. liquidity management needs to be strengthened, and intervention, if any, should be in both directions. Turning then to addressing risks to financial stability. Now, this is an important issue in the region given that it's highly dollarized, and so the big exchange rate movements have had a big effect on balance sheets and bank health. And in broad terms, in the financial sector, there's a need to make efforts to reduce dollarization. Now, dollarization in a way is a measure of confidence in the currencies, and there are no quick fixes. It requires promoting credible macro policies overall, and it may take many years. But it is possible to make some advances in the meantime through removing distortionary controls and taking prudential and regulatory measures. It's also important to bolster financial stability in other ways. Various risk management measures can be taken. Central banks need to have good crisis preparedness plans. There needs to be better coordination both within the country and across borders. And there would need to be robust lender of last resort and emergency liquidity assistance frameworks. Moving to enhancing communication, I guess it's fair to say that communication has not been a strength in central banks in the region, and in the era of more fixed arrangements, that was maybe natural, but with flexibility, it's not good enough for central banks only to come out when there are surprises happening. There's a need to communicate what the central bank is doing, what's happening in the economy, why the central bank is taking the decisions, why inflation outcomes are what they are, and this requires being much more active. And it's not just pure communication. A lot of what's required also involves educating the public, because there's a lot of, understandably, lots of resistance to exchange rate movements when populations have gotten used to stability, and the exchange rate may be seen as an indicator of the economy's overall strength. So the central banks need to get used to communicating in good and bad times and be very patient and repeating the messages. It's also important to overcome the fear of floating that is very widespread, of course, in many parts of the world, but including in the CCA area. The IMF has been working with the countries in the region in many ways in our bilateral discussions, country by country. We provide also technical assistance to countries and have regional events. We are organizing occasionally events for central bankers in the region. We have had a central bank governor level event with central bankers from other regions, another one for deputy governor level central bankers, and we have a very active online platform for central bank practitioners in the region. And I think we have seen very good progress in the region, and I think as far as monetary and exchange rate policies go, the countries have handled a very significant, a very difficult shock quite well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Juha. I think that gives us an overview of how the different experiences of different countries has come together. I just want to pick up on one point that Juha made, which I think is worth noting. As he said, we don't take a view in that paper that all countries need to be at the same point in terms of flexibility or moving to inflation targeting. It depends a bit on their current status and capacity to manage in different ways. But the consequence of wherever you are on that spectrum means that you have to manage the implications of being there. So if you're at more at the fixed end of it, in a way, and you have adjusted your exchange rate but are then keeping it at a fairly fixed level, then you have to recognize that you won't get as much of a shock absorber from the exchange rate as if you're at the other end of it. So I think we have to be, as we've done in the paper, made clear to countries that they can choose where they are, but then they have to live with the consequences of that choice in terms of the other instruments they use for monetary policy management. Let me now turn to Bembya Khulkhachiev. As I said, he's going to give us a perspective from also from the Eurasian Commission, which will then give us a sense of how this fits into a broader perspective as well. Sorry that I...
Добрый день, коллеги. Но многие в зале, наверное, сразу уже поняли, что я не Тимур Сулейменов. К сожалению, Тимур Муратович сейчас занят весьма серьезным другом мероприятии. Он просил передать большой привет и свои извинения. Поэтому я хотел бы представиться, директор департамента финансовой политики Бембя Khulkhachiev. Поэтому, если будут вопросы не к Тимуру, а ко мне, я с удовольствием на них отвечу.
Thank you. So, let me then perhaps raise with you a couple of questions, I think, from a financial policy side, which would be helpful, if I might. One, I think, is, in the context of the Eurasian Economic Union, there's been some discussion of establishing a monetary union. And in your view now, given that countries are moving towards more flexible exchange rates, what are the, how does that fit in with that longer-term vision? And how do you see the evolution of exchange rate policies with still having a longer-term goal of a monetary union?
Вы знаете, сейчас уже вспоминали двухгодичный период, когда произошла резкая девальвация наших национальных валют. И понятно, что с одной стороны это было шоком, с другой стороны, может быть, это было правильно и нужно для наших экономик, когда мы слишком сильно зависели не от того, как мы работаем, не от своей производительности труда, а от просто банальных цен на нефть. Но с другой стороны, это был хороший урок для наших центральных банков и для нашего населения только по одной причине, что это был субъективный фактор, субъективный шок. Мы понимаем, что валютная независимость в наших странах, она существует, и она никем не оспаривается, но с другой стороны, и понятно, что первым решением приняла Российская Федерация, было бы, наверное, правильно в условиях создаваемого союза, сейчас уже действующего союза, если бы Центральный банк Российской Федерации своевременно поставил бы в известность о необходимости предпринятых шагов, которые в любом случае Российская Федерация будет вынуждена принять на тот период времени. И, может быть, вот это чисто такое человеческое отношение к своим партнерам, объяснение этих причин, может быть, оно бы не было таким шоком для населения всех наших стран. Но, с другой стороны, конечно, мы, безусловно, учимся от этих всех дел, и сегодня и в рамках самой комиссии мы выступаем с такой инициативой о том, чтобы наши центральные банки не только отвечали за инфляцию в наших странах, но и вместе с правительством внимательно отслеживали бы за необходимостью экономического роста. Поэтому с нашей стороны было предложение о создании постоянно действующего органа, это Совет финансовой стабильности, куда на обязательной основе будут ходить председатели центральных банков наших стран, министры финансов и министры экономики. И я думаю, когда эти встречи будут происходить на такой постоянной основе, то подобных шоков, которые произошли 2 года назад, 1,5 года назад, для наших экономик, конечно, это не произойдет. С другой стороны, понятно, что низкий курс рубля к доллару, либо к тенге, это не столь опасно, как опасность существует в том, по резкой волатильности наших национальных валют. Когда в течение дня рубль может просесть или повыситься на рубль-1,5, то это ненормально. Это, конечно, с другой стороны, это мешает нашему просто нормальному развитию. В-третьих, мы должны отказываться от банальной привязки своих валют к нефти. Вот вы знаете, мои родные, которые живут в глубинке Российской Федерации, они совершенно не знают соотношения там, или, может быть, даже доллар не видели, но они очень внимательно отслеживают, какова сегодня стоимость доллара к рублю, какова сегодня стоимость барреля к нефти, хотя, то есть как бы уже в нашем сознании, уже психологически вот этот барьер, он существует, нам и от него надо отказываться. Поэтому, когда иногда наши политики говорят о том, что давайте, может быть, создадим наш валютный союз для минимизации тех рисков, которые там имеют место быть, либо ввести единую валюту, то, естественно, мы как эксперты, как экономисты на пальцах объясняем, что этого делать нельзя. Ну, во-первых, такого поручения нет ни со стороны наших президентов, его нет и в договоре. Да, есть поручение президента Российской Федерации, правительству России и Центральному банку рассмотреть возможность создания валютного союза. Но это не значит о том, что мы сегодня либо завтра придем к валютному союзу, либо к единой валюте. Поэтому, безусловно, мы должны в том числе выступать и объяснять нашим народам о том, что это в ближайшее время не произойдет, не потому что мы этого не хотим, может быть, завтра мы к этому придем, а потому что сегодня наша экономика, безусловно, не готова к этому. Потому что объем внутренней торговли между нашими странами за прошлый год у нас составил чуть более 13,5%. Тогда, когда в Европейском Союзе это 60%, тогда уже есть объективные предпосылки к тому, хотя мы знаем, что Европа тоже десятки лет шла к созданию евро, и поэтому мы учитываем и положительные, и отрицательные моменты создания валютного союза, либо введения единой валюты, и подходим к этим вопросам очень осторожно. Многие путают о том, что по договору о создании союза написано, что после 2025 года в Казахстане будет создан наднациональный орган по финансовым рынкам. Но это не значит, что здесь будет находиться Центральный банк, это не значит, что здесь будет находиться эмиссионный центр. Это будет регулятор, который будет писать правила игры для всех сегментов финансового рынка. Рынок ценных бумаг, банковский и страховой.
Thank you very much. I think that gives us at least a medium-term vision, and then the question is how we go from where we are to that. Let me finally turn to Tom Sargent, and Tom, what I'd like to ask you is that you've heard the different panelists. They've brought different perspective from what's been happening in terms of discrepancy or differentiation at the moment in terms of the monetary policy stance across some major central banks, whether it's the euro area and the Fed. You looked at, Juha summarized a bit the work that the IMF has been doing, and we know we have, for the near term at least, countries are pursuing this approach. From your point of view, how do you see now the application of the frameworks for inflation targeting under these circumstances? What would you say are the challenges and that the countries are likely to face in this regard?
Okay, thank you. Okay, the way I'm going to approach this is to think about going back to basics in terms of the constitutions or the architecture of monetary, fiscal, and banking and financial systems. And the key thing is to revisit issues that were on the minds of great economists like John Maynard Keynes and Irving Fisher and Milton Friedman, and basically how you draw lines of two kinds. One is between the fiscal authorities and the central bank, and the other is between money and credit. And these are classic issues. So to get into these, it's good to take a historical perspective and go back to the 19th century, in which the lines were drawn in a particular way, basically throughout the world. In the 19th century, we were advanced countries, and many less developed countries were on the gold standard or a silver standard. And what a gold standard or silver standard is, it's a particular way of drawing a line, and it tells the fiscal authority in the country, but by fiscal authority I mean the authorities that can determine the taxes and the government expenditures, that they're basically on their own, and they do not have access to the printing press or a central bank to finance their expenditures. And what it is, it's a testimony to lack of trust of a government to manage a currency or to deliver a stable price level. And instead of having monetary authorities target inflation or target the price level, they're completely out of that business, and the price level is determined by the market for gold and silver. And that's a system that over 300 or 400 years basically delivered a price level that, while it fluctuated, it was stable in a secular sense. The price level in 1600 was about the same as the price level in 1900 for gold standard countries, and same for silver standard countries. That system was criticized by, first it took a long time for the world to evolve into that system. No country kind of decided to do it. It's interesting to watch the process by which that developed. But intellectuals, academic scribblers like Adam Smith and David Ricardo thought you could get a better system if you had a government that could manage well a paper currency. And this was a proposal that Ricardo issued early in the 19th century. It took a century before it attracted significant adherence. By 1900 it had, but they wouldn't go public with it. And this is the Irving Fisher Keynes idea that you could do better than a gold standard by substituting for the discipline of the gold standard, the discipline of a central bank that knew one thing, the quantity theory of money, that it would not print too much money. So Irving Fisher and John Maynard Keynes aren't the ones who convinced people to try this experiment. It was basically World War I and the Great Depression that forced the world off gold. So this, sometime between 1914 and 1940, this experiment started to be done. And I think the results in hard currency countries like Great Britain would have surprised and disappointed Keynes, because instead of a stable price level that was actually more stable in gold, you got a persistent inflation. And it took about half a century for monetary authorities and fiscal authorities to learn how to manage that system. And it's you know, Milton Friedman's last words on this were, this is an experiment. It's a huge historical departure about trusting some elements of the government. And this experiment, he thought the results weren't all in. And you know, the topic of this discussion is it's not all in yet. So in terms of drawing lines, I want in drawing architectures, these aren't questions about what we do this year. These are questions about what we do recurrently in terms of institutions that we set up somehow. So Milton Friedman had two famous proposals about this, and they were direct opposites of each other about drawing lines. So his first proposal, which was, by the way, very close to a proposal that Keynes had made in 1928, his proposal was this, 1949. It's a framework for monetary and fiscal stability. And his issue is how do you divide authority between a central bank, which controls the printing press, and the Treasury, and the Congress, which controls taxes and government expenditures. Just as background to this, what was Keynes's recommendation? Keynes's recommendation was that you should do the following. You should have the fiscal authorities, the ones who control taxes and expenditures, do their accounting in a special way, and actually a 19th century way. They should have a current account budget which should always be balanced. And they should have a capital account budget which is balanced over the business cycle, but you should time infrastructure projects to fight the business cycle. And what a capital project is, you know what it is. It's a piece of capital equipment that, in some sense, will generate revenues to, in some sense, pay for itself, either in terms of benefits or in terms of tax revenues. And Milton Friedman, actually, without citing Keynes, that's part of his 1949 recommendation. And here's the other part. The government is going to finance government deficits, whatever they are, 100% by printing money. It's never going to resist the, try to fight the fiscal authority. If the fiscal authority runs a deficit or persistent deficit, it's just going to print money and there's going to be inflation. So the way you're going to, and this puts the responsibility for inflation directly at its ultimate cause, which is fiscal policy. It was a way to coordinate monetary and fiscal policy. So if you fast forward 12 years later, Milton Friedman wrote another proposal in terms of drawing a line between the monetary and fiscal authorities. And this was the exact opposite one. Okay, what he said was the monetary authority is going to commit itself to a fixed growth rate rule. It's going to restrict the rate of growth of high-powered money to K% a year, come hell or high water. Doesn't matter if it's a recession or not. And what that's going to do is it's going to cut the fiscal authority off from the central bank, and it's going to force the fiscal authority to balance its budget in a present value sense. The reason I mention these proposals is they're both very sharp, but seemingly diametrically opposed ways of coordinating monetary and fiscal policy. Because they have to be coordinated. They're not independent. And what Friedman was saying and what Keynes was saying was that the engine of inflation, ultimate engine of inflation, is fiscal deficits. The way Keynes put it is what the government spends, the public's going to pay for. And it's going to pay for it either by explicit taxes now or later, or it's going to pay for it by an inflation tax now or later. So that was a call to have a response. If you wanted a stable price level, you were going to have a stable fiscal policy in the face of also all the kinds of shocks that we've been talking about. Now, today, in ways that weren't around when Keynes was around, there's other lines about fiscal policy, and that is what is a government debt and what's a government asset. So in a country like the United States or in Europe, the line between private indebtedness and public indebtedness has become obscured in ways that, that threaten government finances. So there's a book that I'd recommend called Fragile by Design by Calamiris and Haber, which is about financial fragility in various countries across the world, and it's about the interaction of politics and economics that lead to banking systems that are more or less fragile. So the way people at the IMF talk about this is fiscal contingent liabilities. There are things that aren't explicitly on the balance sheet of fiscal authorities, but they might be there. There's contingent liabilities. And there's a website at the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond that talks about the percentage of U.S. private debt that's implicitly insured by the United States government. And that has risen basically monotonically. And it's risen after the financial crisis to around 60%. And we've had episodes in Europe and other countries where these implicit liabilities have become explicit liabilities. So it becomes harder for private market participants who are buying sovereign debts to evaluate the true fiscal health of a government. So I guess my main message is just to say nothing new, but to reiterate what thoughtful economists from the past talked about. You know, the Keynes, Irving Fisher idea of price level targeting or inflation targeting is ultimately a way to tell the fiscal authorities that are on their own. And it's simply not feasible without substantial support from the fiscal authorities. And that's a message just worth repeating.
Thank you very much, Tom. I don't know how many representatives of fiscal authorities are in the room and how they will respond to the point that you made in terms of their being on their own now. And I'm sure there'll be questions on that point. And I think there may also be a question about whether you would say what you've just said in any different way in light of the recent experience in advanced economies, where in some ways the role of monetary policy in terms of providing a stimulus, and now with where we are and getting close to the zero bound, does that change in any way thinking about the relationships between those lines that you've been drawing? But we'll come to that. Let me now open it up and see if there are comments or questions from the audience. And I would encourage you not just to ask a question, but if you have a comment on what you've heard that you'd like to share, please do so. I think there are microphones around. There's a gentleman over there. Let me just make sure I get my...
Можно? Фамилия Байзаков. Фамилия моя Байзаков. Институт экономических исследований Казахстана. Вопрос Томасу Сарженту. Вы сказали действительно правильно относительно одномерности измерения равновесия между реальным и финансовым секторами. Это один из подходов, смитовский подход. Вы начали относительно Смита Рикардо, а на самом деле это первый основной подход, который придерживается западной экономической школы. Есть еще другая школа. была эта школа при Советском Союзе. Она измеряла рыночную экономику, плановую или рыночную, не имеет значения, двухмерным измерением. Валюта измерялась не только деньгами, но и производительностью труда. Производительность труда можно измерить и доходами, и затратами. Вот вопрос. Вы лауреат Нобелевской премии получили за следственные причинные связи между доходами и затратами. Все-таки вы не сказали, какой вклад вы внесли в измерению рыночной экономики, экономического роста. Все-таки скажите, пожалуйста, ваш вклад в развитие рыночной экономики.
Thank you very much. Before I turn to Tom Sargent for that, let me see if there are any other comments. No other questions yet, so let me turn to you, Tom.
Okay, so, So I guess I'll work backwards. So it's true that actually Adam Smith and David Ricardo were using the labor theory of value, which is it's a pretty good theory. It works quite well. It was what all economists used, basically, of all kinds, until around 1860 or so, and then basically it got refined a little bit. It didn't really get changed. We heard a talk by Edward Prescott today, and he never used the word labor theory of value, but it was about technological change and development. We heard actually a couple talks, and the labor theory of value was at the heart of both of them. So that endures, and it was an element in Smith's proposals. In terms of these, the previous question about are these concerns about lines between monetary and fiscal policy active in these days of being near the zero lower bound and quantitative easing? I think they're as active as ever. And the place I would look at, I would recommend, is Ben Bernanke's final speech or paper at Jackson Hole, where he talked about why he thought quantitative easing might or might not matter. And it's a very sophisticated and subtle paper, and it relates to Athanasios' description of the balance sheet of the Fed, which is unprecedented. So, and actually goes back to David Ricardo and Adam Smith, because and a key paper by Neil Wallace. So, and this is all about what the line is between monetary and fiscal policy, and about some things that happened in 2008. So here's what Ben Bernanke's, I think, how to read Ben Bernanke's paper in 2008. So his paper was about two things. Was when the Fed engineered quantitative easing, which is this unprecedented, basically more than tripling the size of the Fed balance sheet, buying assets that were unprecedented, including lots of private assets, mortgage-backed securities. Why did that matter going in? And was it going to matter when we undid it? So, or does it matter at all? So one line that it's kind of a thin line is advocates of this policy want to say that it helped a lot, or at least some going in, but it's not going to hurt going back. So the paper to look at that is Neil Wallace's Modigliani-Miller theorem for government finance. So Neil Wallace put, it's a famous paper, he described exactly this operation, where an idealized version of this operation where the central bank executes a potentially very large open market operation. It's not a helicopter drop, it's an open market operation, where the Fed acquires a whole bunch of perhaps privately held securities, previously privately held, on its balance sheet. And Neil Wallace asked whether that mattered. And what he showed was, if fiscal policy did not change, and he had a particular and a very modern definition of fiscal policy, which had to do with the distribution of taxes across people. He said if fiscal policy did not change, that policy was irrelevant. It had no effect on either prices or quantities. And some people who want to say that undoing quantitative easing actually point to that theorem. And the way I read Ben Bernanke's paper, he's very aware of that theorem. He wants to show that there were deviations in the economic environment from what Neil Wallace said, and he actually cites 3 of them, that made the policy perhaps relevant and potent going in, but the indication is going out will be easy because of Neil's. So when you go into the details of this, and you talk about how you're going to undo that policy, which again is historically unprecedented. So the people like who are pure empiricists aren't going to be able to tell you, give you much guidance. It's this policy is motivated by a hunch and a theory, probably a pretty good theory, but as part of this policy, the Fed, as part of things that happened in 2008, the Fed acquired the ability to pay interest on reserves. And actually, if you go and read Friedman's Program for Monetary Stability, the ability to pay interest on reserves, Milton Friedman said it was really important, but he asked, how are you going to pay the interest on the reserves? Because it matters. And the Fed acquired the ability to pay interest on reserves. That's really a fiscal authority, because it may require at some point in time for the Fed to require the Congress to fund it. So the line between monetary and fiscal policy was altered in a potentially important way as a part of this legislation and as a part of this policy. That's all part of going into this uncharted territory. So it's too long an answer to your question, but I think it's this business of these lines is very active.
Thank you. It's very interesting. It's the front row. Let's get the microphone to you, Mark.
I have a question for Professor Orphanides, and I guess it's for Juha as well. But one of the prescriptions that we've made in the paper is that central banks in the region should build up analytical capacity, should get better at forecasting, should have deeper financial markets, should pay attention to financial sector risks, and communicate better. And then it's quite interesting then to see your presentation, which I thought was excellent, and show that the ECB seems to have made a quite serious policy mistake in 2012. And so how to reconcile those things that I think an ideal of the central banks of this region would be to develop some of the capacity
even a small amount of the capacity that the ECB has, but yet the ECB seemed to have gotten it badly wrong in 2012 with huge consequences. So maybe you could, I guess, follow my train of thought there and take us through if our advice to the central banks of this region is to try and develop better analytical skills, deeper financial markets, better communications, sort of what went wrong in that situation and what conclusions might we draw? Thanks.
Thank you very much, Mark. So we'll see whether all the analytics and the capacity makes a difference in the final analysis. I think there's a lady there who wants to ask a question.
Thank you all for taking part in this panel discussion and interesting presentations. A quick, like one of the panel participants mentioned, potential move to a common currency zone between Russia and Kazakhstan and other customs union members. Given the Eurozone example, can you think of and maybe discuss potential issues and opportunities that Kazakhstan can face due to this potential move to a common currency zone? Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I have one in the back over there.
Thank you. Norbert Funke, Joint Vienna Institute. One question on the inflation targeting regimes. What's the panel advice in terms of a concrete framework? Should it be an inflation band or a point target? And also, should countries target core inflation or headline inflation, or are the institutional environments around it more important than the specifics? Thank you.
Okay, so let's take those three, and then I'll come back to the other questions. So I think the first one was to you, Athanasios, about how we saw whether the building up of the capacity really made a difference in the end. And I think then there's a question about whether in light of the Eurozone we learned something about the feasibility or the preconditions to be able to move to a common currency regime. And I'd be interested in views from people on the panel and particularly I think from Bembya. Then finally I'd like to get a view also of the third question, which is more technical issue in a way, which is, does it matter what you're actually targeting? And if so, what would be our recommendation? So maybe Juha would, from the paper, also want to say something, and then others too. So why don't I turn to you first, and then I'll ask the other.
Thank you. So I will actually say a couple of words on all three questions because they are interrelated for part of our discussion, starting from the lessons from the failure of the euro area for currency zones. I think on that one, in one line, I think we can learn a lot by going back to the debate in the 1980s when the euro area was being discussed. I will cite conclusions that at that time were drawn by a very important central bank in Europe, the Bundesbank. They correctly foresaw that it would be very difficult to manage to have a well-functioning monetary area without sufficient political integration in Europe. Unfortunately, for the euro area, the politicians overruled that technical advice, and we got the results we got. Now, the reason I mention this is because the failure of the euro area really reflects terrible politics, not anything more complicated than that. And for anybody entertaining idea of a currency union in other regions, I get similar questions for the GCC countries, for example, in the Gulf. The issue is how robust is the political framework that would ensure the cooperation of the member states and governments if a monetary union is formed. If the political framework is not robust, as for example has been shown not to be in the case of Europe, then it would certainly be a bad idea. I started from that because if we want to evaluate the massive mistake that the ECB committed, despite its superb analytical ability, we really need to take into account the fact that the ECB is an institution that is in an impossible position. I mean, I know the ECB as an institution very well. I know the Federal Reserve as an institution very well. And I mention this because I think that the analytical capabilities of those two institutions are really top of the line in both cases. But in one case, the case of the Fed can deal with one fiscal authority, one government. In the other case, we actually see that the ECB has been pretty much under attack in various ways, most of it not in public. That can actually lead to mistakes, lead to problems such as we've seen. So I say this because then to link it to is analytical ability either necessary or sufficient for delivering good monetary policy performance, when the case of the ECB is not because the politics is so messed up. But I have to say that when it comes to situations like faced here, we have one country, one monetary authority, one fiscal authority, the question is what is a monetary regime that works in practice, and then evaluate the extent to which it requires analytical support. In my view and experience over the past quarter century, it's not inflation target is not really much older than that, is that it does not take a whole lot of technical sophistication. Yes, it's true that good forecasting, and good forecasting means forecasting that recognizes that forecasts are often wrong and trying to evaluate the risks around them. Good forecasting is an important aspect of monetary policy. And other policies as well, but on monetary policy in particular. So the technical capability of developing good forecasts, including recognizing why forecasts are missed and explaining that, and developing the communication capability that was highlighted, I think this is part of a successful regime. But it's not rocket science. It does not really entail complicated modeling. And let me remind you in this. I mean, following Tom, I will define history to be things that happened more than 20 years ago, not the previous century, not a century ago even. When the New Zealanders started inflation targeting, they didn't really have complicated models. Just to give you an idea, let's remember how these things happen. They started creating inflation forecasts using a model that they borrowed from Bank of Canada, that wasn't even estimated for parameters in their own country. And yet, this is not what mattered. What mattered is that they had an intellectual framework that helped them use their judgment to come up with good forecasts and then explain sometimes very difficult monetary policy decisions in order to achieve the results. This is the basis of inflation targeting. Yes, analytical capability is good. Yes, it should be developed. But you do not need to get the analytical capability of the ECB or even 1/10 of that in order to get it right. Given the opportunity, I will highlight one element that I think is vastly more important than that, which also relates to the elements of Tom's description earlier. The question is where you draw the line. When you are talking about institutional design, the question is how independent would the central bank be? As was mentioned in the IMF report, it's easy these days to say that every bank is independent in some form because some law says that. But we know that as a practical matter, actual independence varies a lot. And successful monetary policy and successful institution building requires the acceptance that an institution like the central bank needs to be more independent than other institutions may tend to be in a country, in practice, not just in law. So in my view, the success of inflation targeting in an economy would actually depend much more on accepting and educating the public on the importance of respecting the independence of some decisions that the central bank needs to make that sometimes may be unpopular. This is exactly how you solve the dynamic inconsistency problem of delivering good outcomes in the long run.
Thank you very much. Anybody else want to add anything to it? You anything? Do you want to add anything to that?
Not to that question, but actually it relates very much to what was asked about the specifics of inflation targeting. I mean, I fully agree with Professor Orphanides that you don't need highbrow modeling or very sophisticated frameworks to have inflation targeting. And also regarding things like whether there should be a range or a point target, or whether it's core or headline inflation, I think one wants to be pragmatic and look at the circumstances. The key thing is to convey the central bank's intentions, and for the central bank to be able to reasonably, credibly deliver on those intentions. I mean, there may be a situation where early on in the process, with the presence of several shocks, the fan chart might be really wide, and it probably wouldn't be a good signal for the central bank to say that its inflation target is between 5 and 15%. I mean, that might not be a good signal about its intentions and its credibility to deliver. But so it depends on circumstances. On core inflation or headline inflation, in principle, core inflation makes sense, but in many countries, population has no idea what core inflation means. And if central banks told the public that they are targeting some concept that no one understands, it would have difficulty communicating. So it may be more pragmatic to talk about headline inflation, even recognizing that in the region, in many countries, food may be even half of the CPI, and so what's happening to headline inflation may have little to do with underlying inflation. But so I would be very pragmatic.
Thank you. Let me take two other questions. 1, 2. There was one in the middle here first. No. 1, 2. And then I'll come to the panelists also for any final comments they want to make. So let me start with you. There's a microphone to the lady over here.
Спасибо. У меня такой вопрос. Когда мы читаем теорию инфляционного таргетирования, это одно. Когда мы на своей шкуре чувствуем, как внедряется процесс инфляционного таргетирования, это совсем другое. В Казахстане инфляция достигла где-то 15-16%, но сейчас мы видим, что в связи со снижением спроса, потребительского поведения населения, инфляция имеет тенденцию к снижению. Национальный банк установил базовую ставку в размере 15%, плюс-минус небольшой коридор. Но мы обращаем внимание на то, что сейчас базовая ставка пока Национального банка, она не стала настоящей базовой ставкой, которая регулирует инфляционные процессы. Пока она сейчас идет постфактум за рыночными ставками. Но мы видим, что идет снижение, идет повышение доверия населения к национальной валюте, идет дедоларизация депозитов. То есть есть некоторые движения, это пока еще очень небольшие. И мне хотелось бы спросить, в какой момент базовая ставка Национального банка становится действительно инструментом регулирования инфляции? То есть вот этот момент я хотела прояснить у вас.
Thank you very much. I think there was another question there. First I'll come here and then I'll come back to you. Yeah, please.
Okay, thank you. I have a question to Professor Sargent. Do central banks should be explicitly responsible for ensuring financial stability? And is there a contradiction between financial stability goal and monetary stability goal? Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's a very good question. Now,
okay. Darko Lukman of Cessna Capital Brokerage Firm. Another question is for Professor Sargent. My question is, despite we have encountered huge currency devaluation in the last year or so, purchasing power of tenge is not that bad. And should you have come a year ago to Kazakhstan, you'd afford yourself twice as less goods and services as now. So some empirical research papers state that purchasing power tend to catch up with changes in the currency value in 5 years on average. Do you think that's the case with Kazakhstan? That's it.
All right, so we have 3 questions. 2 of them are about Kazakhstan. Is the policy rate, when does the policy rate actually, the base rate become policy tool? How far are we, as the last question went, in terms of adjusting? And then there's a more general question, which is whether central banks should have responsibility for financial stability as well as price stability, and could there be a tension between the two? And I presume if that is a tension, how should one deal with that tension as well? So maybe I'll come to Professor Sargent first, and then I think on the question of the trade-off between price stability and financial stability, I'm sure, Tom, you'll have a view, but others also may have a view. So I'll use that as an opportunity to ask the panelists to respond to any questions or any other points they want to make. Please go ahead.
Okay, so good questions. So in terms of financial stability and monetary stability, is there a tension? Yes. You're not supposed to say this, but an official inside the Federal Reserve once said to me that the job of monetary policy is to convert bad loans into good loans. So how do you do that? Well, if the loans, in the United States, if loans are denominated in your own currency, then an inflation will repair the balance sheets of debtors and harm the balance sheet of creditors. It'll redistribute. But the whole idea of the Roosevelt going off gold, he went off gold on the advice of Irving Fisher, and it was explicitly to raise the price level to the level. The United States had had a big reduction in prices, which had caused debtors to have larger debts than they had in real terms initially incurred. Irving Fisher's advice was somehow reverse that and raise the price level in order to inflate away those debts. So there's example after example of that. So monetary policy is definitely linked to that. And the whole goal of a price level targeting or price low inflation targeting is to get the central bank out of that business. But there's recurrent temptations to get back into it. You could, and so I could give you an example. There's a stunning example from Hong Kong in 1983, where there was a financial crisis. There was a bubble in in the commercial market, commercial property market. It was financed by uninsured institutions. There was no explicit deposit insurance. The bubble burst, and a bunch of financial, essentially shadow banks were underwater. And the Monetary Authority of Hong Kong fixed that with a very sudden exchange rate depreciation that wasn't based on any fundamentals, because they had plenty of reserves. They had huge reserves. They did that in order to repair balance sheets. And it worked like a charm. You don't need lawyers. Anyway, your question's right on the money. So then in terms of your thing about the purchasing power of money, the purchasing power parity. So one empirical regularity is purchasing power parity theory. It doesn't work well in a quote-unquote short run, but it works very well in the long run. And in country after country, it's after a certain number of years, the prices fall into line. And I would bet on that empirical regularity for Kazakhstan or any other country.
Спасибо большое. Я хотел бы, знаете, на те вопросы, которые здесь звучали, даже исходя из нашей практической деятельности, ответить следующим образом. В Российской Федерации сейчас тоже идет очень большая дискуссия, что нужно делать нашим монетарным властям. И на днях будет встреча, наверное, с либерального крыла, который представляет господин Кудрин, и консервативного крыла, условно его так можно назвать, это Столыпинский клуб, что нужно сделать сегодня в экономике. Потому что мы все прекрасно знаем, ключевая ставка в Российской Федерации 11%, она осталась, тогда, когда уже инфляция стала ниже самой этой цифры. И пока мы не видим никаких предпосылок, несмотря на то, что и бизнес это просит, с тем, чтобы ключевая ставка хотя бы была понижена на 0,5%. Она не повлияет сильно на развитие экономики, безусловно, потому что в лоб, что по лбу, что 10,5%, что 11%, это все равно не очень высокие ставки. Но, с другой стороны, она дала бы некий тренд, сигнал и обществу, и бизнесу, и нашим предприятиям. И нас, помимо чисто таких теоретических вопросов, волнует то, что в наших странах центральные банки это уже стали супер такими ведомствами. Никто не хочет покушаться на их независимость, но, с другой стороны, банки, в чьих уже руках находится и финансовый рынок, это рынок ценных бумаг, страховой рынок, он уже, к сожалению, фондовый рынок перестал выполнять ту главенствующую роль, которую он раньше делал. Это наполнение деньгами не только за счет банковских кредитов в экономику. Просто лет 15 назад в Российской Федерации соотношение доли акций и облигаций где-то было 100% ВВП. 100% ВВП. То есть не всегда предприятия обращались, а сегодня все от этого зависит. И уровень заработной платы, и развитие экономики, когда они обращались через инструменты финансового рынка, приобретали и спокойно развивались. То сегодня, конечно, картина весьма и весьма печальная. Поэтому что мы хотим для наших 5 стран сделать? Мы хотим, чтобы наши рынки хотя бы в этой части были открыты. В Казахстане и в Российской Федерации скоро будут проходить очень интересные приватизационные такие процессы. И когда мы тогда спрашивали, почему казахстанские эмитенты не размещаются параллельно на московской бирже и казахстанской бирже, нам говорили, это политика, этого делать нельзя. Это тоже неправильно, потому что чем выше интерес к этим бумагам, тем эмитент, конечно, принесет гораздо больше денег размещение IPO, которое он там будет проводить. Поэтому на сегодняшний момент мы понимаем, что только с 2025 года мы открываем свои финансовые рынки друг другу. Но хотя бы до этого момента, то есть это автоматическое признание лицензии, хотя бы до этого момента разрешить открывать филиалы кредитных организаций. Следовательно, потребителю финансовых услуг у него уже будет выбор, какие условия, какие процентные ставки, какой банк более надежен. Но для того, чтобы минимизировать все вот эти риски, мы работаем сейчас над соглашением об обмене сведений, входящих в состав кредитных историй. То есть мы хотим такими маленькими шажками сегодня узнавать друг о друге, Для того, чтобы, если я безупречно работал у себя в стране и завтра буду работать в другой, я обращусь в кредитное учреждение, чтобы безупречная репутация, она была бы здесь учтена. И то, что касается фондового рынка, мы разработали, сейчас находится в правительствах соглашение брокер-дилеры. Тоже интересное, кстати, соглашение. Вроде бы напрямую к сегодняшней дискуссии она не имеет, но с другой стороны, мы до признания лицензии в 2025 году сегодня разрешаем нашим профучастникам приходить на фондовые рынки наших стран со своими капиталами. То есть мы не делаем градацию. Это резиденты стран, входящих в Союз, либо это клиенты, которых я обслуживаю из других стран. То есть мы понимаем совокупность всех факторов, которые помогут нашим центральным банкам сегодня и, безусловно, отвечать в соответствии с Конституцией за инфляцию, безусловно, но и в то же время с тем, чтобы инструментарий или возможности Центрального банка, они так или иначе были сопоставимы с их, с действиями экономических властей, правительств. Это две неотъемлемые части единого целого для улучшения экономики и жизни наших людей. Спасибо.
Thank you very much. Juha, anything you want to conclude?
So on inflation targeting in Kazakhstan, it's early days, but I think the basic elements are in place. There's a floating exchange rate that reflects what's happening in the economy, and also there's the base rate. But one should keep in mind that there are long lags between changes in the base rate and its impact on the rest of the economy and inflation. And so the central bank needs to have a very forward-looking approach. Changing the base rate now will do nothing to inflation today or next month. It will take several months or longer. And the central bank needs to explain this together with other elements of inflation targeting. I mean, it has a view on inflation 6 or 12 months from now, and it's taking measures proactively so that over time inflation moves toward the target.
Thank you. Athanasios, any final thoughts?
Sure. Two brief comments on the two questions. First, on price stability and financial stability. I mean, Tom is absolutely right on the interrelations, but from his examples, you could also see that most of the time, price stability and financial stability go together. So maintaining stable prices, stable low inflation actually avoids deflation situations or high inflation situations that create imbalances between debtor and creditor. So central bank may need to undo mistakes, but maintaining price stability actually over the long term usually helps promote financial stability as well. During crisis times is when you have the tensions that really arise in a major way, that do not necessarily line up with each other. In those situations, you do have tensions, and precisely because of those tensions, it absolutely is a good idea to have financial stability explicitly recognized as one of the objectives of the central bank, as is done in a number of countries. With regard to the instruments to use, absolutely the policy rates must be an instrument that the central bank should independently use in order to attain its inflation objective in an inflation targeting regime. But as was mentioned just a minute ago, the inflation targeting regime is a forecast-based regime. So the key is whether the central bank's forecasts are lining up well with the inflation target at some horizon that is relevant for that economy, given the transmission mechanism of that economy, it could be 1 year in some cases, it could be 2 years in other cases. This means that there is no mechanical rule that would link the policy rate and today with inflation today, but there will be a very strong correlation between forecast of inflation, say 1 year out forecast of inflation, and policy rates. If developments suggest that inflation forecast 1 year out rise before the target, then absolutely one would expect the policy rate or other instruments to adjust. For the situation of Kazakhstan today in particular, I would also note that because of the transition, because the regime is so recent, you also have the additional dynamics that complicate the situation. It was mentioned that we have also some partial dollarization and so forth. These are some of the conditions that need to be tackled by the central bank with care in its decisions, both on the policy rate and on other instruments it has at its disposal in order to achieve its objectives.
Thank you very much. Well, I think we've certainly had a lot of food for thought, including a long historical perspective, a short historical perspective, a very practical perspective, and a prescriptive, forward-looking dimension as well. So let me ask you now to join me in thanking the panelists for their excellent contributions, and thank you for your own participation in the seminar.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, we are looking forward to greet you tomorrow on the second part of our session at 8:45 a.m. Уважаемые дамы и господа, мы будем рады видеть вас на второй части наших сессий завтра в этом зале в 8:45 утра.